Hello, Akira here, and welcome back to the channel. In today's video essay, we're going to be taking a look at answering the question, what's the worst stat in Fire Emblem generally? Fairly obviously, I think, I'll put forward my case that it's res. Not all of the recurring basic combat stats are made equal. The most typically valued stats are the trio of strength or magic, depending on the unit's specific key offensive stat, speed as both an offensive and defensive stat, and defense as, well, a defensive stat, since most enemies deal physical damage. Then people typically joke about all of Dex/skill, luck, and res to some extent, with HP living in a state where it is neither highly praised nor dunked on. So, why are these stats valued less? Briefly, the reasoning behind Dex, Luck, and Res being rated low are as follows. Hit rate comes mostly from weapons and skills rather than skill the stat, as does crit rate for attempting to crit stack. Luck is usually a threshold stat with diminishing returns past that point, in terms of avoiding getting crit, and has smaller effects elsewhere, plus having only a minor impact in standard play. And Res is the defensive stat against magical enemies, who are both less common than physical enemies and easier to one-round KO, and there are also often ways of augmenting it. Luck in particular gets memed on pretty hard. I've seen many things online talking about how unhelpful luck is as a stat, and while the poll base is small, it was voted the least valuable stat in the community poll that I conducted in the run-up to this video. Thank you to everyone who voted and commented on said poll. As mentioned previously though, I think that the least valuable stat of the three across the series generally is res. As a result, much of this video will be dedicated to defending the use cases of skill and luck, before going into why res is often not impactful. Disclaimer hours. This is not me saying that res is never useful. Part of my argument behind why res isn't generally useful is that it may be a stat needed only on a singular unit. Equally, I do not believe that it is always the worst stat. There are some games where the luck stat truly does nothing of consequence. Anyway, that's enough preamble, so first of all, let's take a look at Dex/skill. While I wasn't expecting Dex to win the coveted moniker of most useless stat, I was also surprised it got basically any votes at around 8% of the vote total. Still, I disagree that it's the worst stat. Dexterity or skill contributes to hit chance, and is therefore not difficult to reason why it can be an impactful stat. If you don't hit the enemy, you're not killing them. And generally, killing the enemy is a good thing. While hit comes primarily from the weapon being wielded, in addition to skills proper on the relevant unit, Dex helps to increase this number and therefore improves reliability. This is especially the case since in most games, 1 point of Dex gives 2 points of hit. Even with weapon triangle advantage, Dex can be particularly noteworthy when attacking units with high avoid, such as Swordmasters in games without breaker skills, or in games where weapon hit is generally lower. The best example of a game that combines both aspects of this is FE6. While obviously not a standard context, this can be brought to its extreme in a setting where weapon hit has been universally altered to be 0. I've had the privilege of getting to be around on voice call, while my friend Heroic Valplume has been playing around with no-hit conquest. Though a full exploration of the mod and its implications goes beyond the scope of this video, it leads to a very strange situation where Gunter is a significantly better unit than a Xander, and you can get true Nyx hit gaming hours. Anyway, as a stat that improves reliability, this makes Dex a very valuable stat in certain contexts where anything less than 100 hit on your part is less than ideal. A prime example of this is an Iron Man, a no reset or rewind run, but this is also true in a run that tries to go faster while maintaining some degree of reliability, such as a run aiming for a low expected turn count. It's true that the Fire Emblem RNG lies to us. Due to the true hit system in most of the games from FE6 onward, a 90 is more likely to hit than 90% of the time, actually being a 98.10% chance. Even in Sign RN, in Fates, Echoes, and Engage, it's a 97% chance to actually hit. Still, you can see a lot of rounds of combat in Fire Emblem, and if you're absolutely counting on all of your attacks to hit, one of them is probabilistically going to miss eventually. While Dex is primarily important for hit rate reliability, it can also be important for how it can contribute to damage in many games in the form of either crits or proc skills. Note that I do not specify reliability in this case. Starting with crit stacking to 100 is usually a more difficult affair than hit stacking to 100, because Dex both contributes to crits less, typically 1 point of crit per 2 Dex, and weapons with crit have lower crit values than hit rates. Additionally, skills such as Wrath in its various iterations, or personal skills such as Panette's Blood Fury or Linden's Weapon Insight and Engage often contribute more to crit than the Dex stat itself does. Then moving on to proc skills, unless you have very specific builds set up to maximize activation rate and minimize risk, like a Breaker Soul Ninja, they're inherently unreliable. This is to the point where many proc skills can be liabilities, especially if they boost damage without having an additional defensive effect, like Soul does. For example, non-rigged high-level Fates advice often includes the tip to unequip Dragon Fang from Corrin as soon as possible, as activating it can potentially lead to suffering from success, or messing up your experience or support point routing. Still though, this additional damage potential is worth noting as it can happen, both in standard play and in specific contexts. The most obvious specific context where it comes in handy is a rigged low turn count run, where you can guarantee possible crits or skill procs if they're useful to you. Toffee's super rig LTCs of Fates involve legal crits and offensive skill procs where helpful, and in LTCs of Engaged Maddening, Tamara has a potential niche, as Sandstorm makes her the easiest unit to hit the 1 round KO threshold on Morvier in the Miasma on chapter 19. Combined, this means that Dex has worth as a stat that contributes to reliability and also to possibility. Both of these are things I value highly as a sometimes Iron Mana, sometimes Super Rig LTCer, and thus disqualifies it from being the worst general basic stat for me. This mindset of contributing both to reliability and, to a lesser extent, possibility is something that I also consider to be the case for the Lck stat. So, I'm not arguing that the Lck stat is the best thing ever. This isn't helped by how the Lck stat is weird and inconsistent. Said inconsistency is reflected in the flavor text across the various games, which typically reads something along the lines of, "This affects many different things," and these things vary according to the specific game in question. With some exceptions, it generally contributes to all of dodge, crit avoid, hit, and avoid. Each 2 points of luck typically gives 2 dodge and 1 hit and avoid. Given that there are exceptions, many of them, it would be remiss of me not to at least mention some of them. In FE1 and Gaiden, there is no crit avoid, meaning that you are always liable to getting crit, and the only thing luck helps you to avoid is magical attacks. In Thracia, Fates, and Shadows of Valentia, the impact of luck on reducing enemy crit rate is reduced, taking 2 points of luck to offset 1 crit. In some games, luck also contributes to crit rate. It does so in all of FE1, Gaiden, Shadows of Valentia, and Three Houses, and in all of these, 2 points of luck contribute 1 point of crit. And then also in Three Houses, your personal luck stat before skills, etc. contributes to your success rate when gambling certifications that you don't have the guaranteed ranks for. The effects are clearly varied, both in terms of effect itself and impact thereof. At the very least, the contribution to both hit and crit means that any points in favour of skill on these fronts are also true for luck. However, this is to a much lesser extent, not least because in most games, luck doesn't contribute to crit at all. Additionally, on the possibility side of things, luck is the trigger stat for some proc skills such as Miracle in many games, Arms Thrift in Awakening, or Engage Anna's Make a Killing. So in all of these aspects, luck is kind of like a skill light, sometimes with a bit of extra void as a treat. Where luck is most keenly felt though is in reliability, with having low luck being really irritating in Iron Mans. As an atypical example, in Three Houses where your crit rate before weapons and skills is Dex plus luck all divided by 2, Dimitri's low luck is an annoying trait, as it means that he may not be able to stack 100 crit on all enemies for his Battalion Banrath setup. There is therefore a non-zero chance that he'll fail to crit any given enemy, get hit and die, thus ending the run in failure. The actual typical example is luck as the main contributor of crit avoid, which is important for avoiding your own units getting crit, because funnily enough, getting hit for triple the damage is kind of a lot. Kidding aside, this can be a constant risk, especially in games where low percentage crits are everywhere, such as the luck divided by 2 dodge games, or games where most of the cast has laughable luck, such as Sacred Stones. Sacred Stones is particularly notable for being the source of the luck curve meme with La Rochelle and Null. Still, even for units that have middling to high luck, depending on the enemy type or context in question, this may not be sufficient to mitigate the chances of getting crit entirely. For example, there are many unit types with inherent crit boosts, such as Berserkers or Swordmasters in many iterations, or Snipers in Radiant Dawn. This may also be the case for games where enemy dex is generally high, with Radiant Dawn once again being one such example. Of course, a dearth of luck isn't necessarily a fatal flaw for a unit. Going back to Null, it can be argued perfectly reasonably that it doesn't matter whether he would face crit if he saw combat. Especially with the Lightning Rod effect of summons, should he go Summoner, he may well not see any rounds of combat himself. This renders enemy crit chance against him moot. Even for a low luck unit who is going to see combat, there are many methods of reducing or removing enemy crit rate entirely, such as supports that increase dodge, weapons that mitigate crit, such as Fate's bronze weapons and various engraves from Fire Emblem Engage, skills that reduce enemy crit, such as Tamara's personal skill, Racket of Psalm, or even skills that prevent them, such as Fortune, items that prevent units from getting crit in the form of the Hop-Long Guard, and even the rewind mechanic from Shadows of Valentia onward as a method for working around low percentage crits or other undesirable outcomes. Still, it is undeniably true that without sufficient planning in advance, low luck can severely impact the rounds of combat that a unit is capable of seeing with the guarantee of safety. As a result, while it is still a threshold stat where you don't care about it that much past a certain value, having it in appreciable quantities is definitely better than not for any general unit. Now let's look at Res. On paper, Res should be good. After all, defense is good, and Res is just the magical version of defense, right? Well, not quite. First of all, magical enemies are typically less common than physical enemies. Maps like Hector Mode Cog of Destiny with majority enemies that hit on Res are the exception, not the rule. If anything, most FE maps are closer to the reverse, majority physical, with a select few, if any, magical enemies. Secondly, they are also generally easier to one-round KO, as they are typically middling to low speed tier enemies with low defense and HP, and therefore low one-shotable bulk. This can be to the extent that they can be one-shot proper with a sufficiently high strength physical unit. Leading on from this point, Res and HP are often inversely correlated. A high Res unit will have low HP and vice versa, which is reflected very clearly in, for instance, the class caps for Sage and Berserker in Fire Emblem Engage. Both of these lead to high one-shotable magical bulk, with more magical bulk actually being in favour of the low res physical unit due to HP itself being a bulk stat. HP as your bulk stat for surviving magical hacks is also true to an extent in the various Arcanea games, as well as Valentia. As a result, this means that in addition to being easy to kill, magical enemies are also not that comparatively hard to survive and kill individually, and they are often just there as individuals, meaning that it is often possible, and even reasonable, to have a unit with notably low res simply avoid seeing combat with magical enemies if desired. Instead, if you want, you can have a specialist quote-unquote mage slayer deal with them, as much as the term is memed on. If magical enemies are incredibly threatening, then your res has to be significantly higher to make a meaningful difference, such as Shadows of Valentia Est as a Falcon Knight being able to survive an Arcanist and a Fiend on Duma Gate due to her res, when neither of her sisters would be able to. That's before we get onto the ways of augmenting res. In the generic sense, similarly to how many games allow supports to increase dodge, many, though fewer, games allow supports to increase generalized defense, encompassing both defense and res when support partners are in range. If we accept support as a method for increasing dodge and therefore mitigating a unit's luck issue, then we should also accept them as a method for increasing magical bulk. Additionally though, many games in the series have methods specifically of increasing res that they do not for other stats. In these games, this is in the form of the Barrier Staff and /or the Pure Water item. Both of these can be used to give a unit 7 temporary res immediately, with the amount decreasing by 1 each turn. 7 defensive bulk, whenever you want, is pretty huge, and means that with adequate item management, you can bring any unit up a whole res tier for key turns, or, more likely, key rounds of combat, with Barrier and Pure Water not being limited items in the same way as the Hop-Long Guard, which there typically only one of. This makes it far less finicky to manage, in my opinion. Lastly, status staves are really not a factor here. I broadly believe that status staves being present is largely just an item management check for restore staves. And then, even for games with guaranteed status staff hit if the user's magic is higher than the target's res, such as FE4, I would argue that the main important thing isn't the unit's res proper, but rather the res conferred from equipping items such as the Mistletoe or the Tear Thing. That mostly covers my point. Still, something that I feel I should mention briefly, since it influences my thinking as a sometimes Iron Manner, sometimes LTCer, is how I feel about Lck and Res on enemies. If I see that an enemy has high res, frankly, I don't care. FE7 bosses aside, if an enemy has high res, they probably have lower defense, so I was probably going to have a physical unit deal with them anyway. However, if I see that an enemy has high luck, I dislike it twofold. First, from the reliability perspective, extra avoid on an enemy, especially a boss who is often on avoid boosting terrain, means that more hit is needed in order to maximise the chances of success. I dislike this from an Iron Manning perspective. Then, from a possibilities perspective, in the same way that higher dex on your unit opens up the possibility of critting the enemy, higher luck on the enemy limits the possibility of critting them. I separate this from reliability as realistically, the difference between 14 or 15 crit or 97 and 100 is not that big, and will only matter on average across the course of several dozens of rounds of combat. Mind, this may become a concern for a build that indexes on reliable enemy phase combat, such as the example of Dimitri's crit stacking potential in a Blue Lion's Iron Man. Where this matters more for me is the difference between 0 and 1 crit. As an LTCer who focuses on super rig rather than more reliable clears, I crit and it is beneficial to me, which is in most rounds of combat where it is theoretically possible. This means that especially at the start of the run, units that have low dex or skill bases can have difficulty gaining enough experience to snowball due to being unable to crit and therefore efficiently kill enemies, and enemies with notably high luck can be a headache to get rid of, with limited action economy if no one can crit them. This combination means I don't value res much as a stat on my own units and don't mind it on enemies generally, and also that I dislike the presence of luck on enemy units and like it on my own units. End result, res continues to fall in my personal estimation. I admit that this is said from the niche perspective of a super rig LTCer, as such it likely has no bearing on the thought process that takes place during quote-unquote standard play. Regardless, I figured it was worth discussing since it is a Fire Emblem context that I think about. Anyway, returning to the conclusion. Going over the 3 memed on stats. Dex or skill I believe to be an important stat for both reliability and possibility purposes, in the forms of increased hit chance and potential damage increases through crit and skill procs respectively. Regarding luck, I consider it to be skill light in these contexts, albeit to a lesser extent due to its lower impact on hit and crit, and fewer relevant proc skills relating to luck. Where I consider it important is as the primary source of dodge across the series, thus greatly reducing the chances of your own units getting crit in combat for reliability, and also reducing your displayed crit chance on enemies for theoretically possible play. By comparison, res is a specialist stat rather than one appreciated by anyone seeing combat. It is also one that is easily augmented in most games, I would argue more easily than dodge, in addition to being one that I largely don't care about the presence of on enemy units. This leads me to conclude that it is the least impactful, and therefore the most meme-worthy of the basic stats. Of course, this is coloured by the different playstyles with which I sometimes approach Fire Emblem. I do not think that my thoughts on luck as a super rig LTCer will necessarily be applicable to other contexts. Still, it increases the number of contexts within which luck is a relevant stat, and is a context that I consider in detail, so I figured I should mention it in my video. Additionally, I fully admit that there are contexts within which luck is worse than res. FE1 and Gaiden are the prime examples of this, where luck doesn't provide any crit avoid. This is especially the case in the latter, since res can actually be a relevant stat there, and so this is also the case in its very faithful remake, Shadows of Valentia. That's why this is a general, rather than all-encompassing and all-context-specific conclusion. Obviously though, it's completely understandable if you disagree with me, even after I've explained my thought process. Disagreement is a-okay in my book, while I obviously believe that I'm right to some extent, or I wouldn't have written this script. I also wouldn't have done anything with it if I thought it was self-evident and indisputable. So whether you agree or disagree with me, I'd love to know. All I really care about is that I made sense. Anyway, thanks for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, I really appreciate you letting me know, whether it's through liking it, commenting on it, or subscribing to the channel if you haven't already. Additionally, if you'd like to keep up to date better with my future projects, or even just talk Fire Emblem with me a bit, you can join the community Discord in the description. Thanks again for watching, and I hope to see you again next time. Until then, have a good one.